In the winter of 1859, on a Louisiana plantation beyond St. Francisville, an elderly black woman existed whom people had long since stopped considering among the living. They addressed her as Mama Edna when they required a task performed, an item transported, a recollection provided, or a body interred. When her services were unnecessary, she was addressed by no name whatsoever. She was reputed to be 103 years old, and this was not an approximation. Not roughly a century old, not born in some distant past, but precisely 103. Sufficiently aged to have observed boys transform into masters, masters into corpses, and their sons into replicas of the same affliction. Sufficiently aged to have witnessed the paint change on the main house, the names within the ledger, the faces in the family Bible, and the grave markers beyond the oak line. Sufficiently aged to understand that white men considered their governance perpetual solely because they imagined time belonged to them. It never did. By December of that same year, Edna moved with a curved spine and a left foot that dragged. Her knuckles were deformed from field labor that had commenced prior to Thomas Jefferson's demise. Her right eye had developed a milky opacity at its periphery. Her breathing was shallow in the morning chill. To the young overseer, Gideon Price, she appeared like a piece of fabric exposed to rain for too extended a period. To the current plantation master, Elias Whitcomb, she represented something less than that, an afterthought, an antique, a body too aged to be traded and too obstinate to perish. That was the miscalculation. Plantation records, whenever they persist, convey falsehoods in neat penmanship. They document age next to valuation, sex next to labor capacity, birth next to ownership. They condense entire existences into numerical columns, yet even their deceptions can expose them. In the Whitcomb ledger for November 1859, a single entry appears without monetary value, without assigned duty, without anticipated output, merely a name inscribed in faded brown ink: Edna, female, Negro, aged unfit. Unfit for whom? Not for remembrance, not for bearing witness, not for the ultimate act that household had approaching. By that time, Mama Edna had survived 6 masters. 6 men who had inherited authority, as though it were a birthright, and wielded it, as though cruelty were a form of discipline. Men who purchased infants before they could stand, sold mothers while their infants' milk was still drying on their skin, bred children for debt alleviation, and knelt in church on Sundays petitioning God to bless their plunder. The South generated many such men. History has preserved too many of their names, and too little of the individuals they crushed beneath them. Therefore, allow the record to be amended here. Whatever existed on that Louisiana soil in 1859 was not civilization. It was systematized captivity, financed by cotton, protected by legislation, and consecrated by hypocrisy. And within it, still drawing breath, was Edna. No one in the main house feared her, because no one there could conceive of an elderly enslaved woman possessing a private existence of significance. They assumed age had depleted her. They mistook quietude for capitulation. They confused perseverance with defeat, as masters invariably do. She slept in a narrow cabin near the wash yard, in a chamber that smelled of ash, camphor, and damp timber. Through the fractured seam in one wall, wind entered during the night. On a peg beside her straw mattress hung a faded blue headcloth, meticulously folded. Beneath the bed, a wooden box, unadorned and secured with a lock. At the foot of the mattress, a child's blanket, repaired so frequently that the original material could no longer be differentiated from the patches. That blanket belonged to her grandson, Josiah. He was 12 years old in the final weeks of 1859, tall for his age, lean, nimble-fingered, robust through the shoulders from stable labor. He possessed his mother's eyes and the troublesome tendency to gaze directly at white men when they uttered falsehoods. That inclination alone could result in a black child being beaten in Louisiana, but Josiah had endured worse than beatings. He had survived infancy on a plantation, which was no minor achievement. He had survived a fever at age 6. He had survived the auction that dispatched his 2 older sisters southward in 1854. He had survived the sale of his mother, Ruth Ann, in the spring of 1856, when Elias Whitcomb cleared gambling debts by converting human beings into currency. Edna had not endured those events untouched. No one did. She had simply persisted. That is a different matter. By the time this narrative commences, Josiah was the final grandchild remaining to her. The final one within reach. The final one whose face she could still touch with her own hands. Every other child that had descended from her line had been consumed by the machinery of the trade, sold to sugar plantations, taken by illness, beaten into frailty, or disappeared into distances upon which the plantation system depended. Separation was not an incidental aspect of slavery. It was one of its driving mechanisms. Shatter the family, shatter the future. Sell the child, punish the mother. Sell the mother, discipline the child. Repeat until compliance appears instinctive. Edna had observed that methodology in operation for nearly a century, and yet the boy remained. In daylight, people perceived only fragments of their connection. The way Josiah decelerated his steps when passing her cabin. The way he brought firewood without being instructed. The way Edna reserved the more tender portion of cornbread for him and pretended she had no appetite. The way her face, typically rigid as sculpted bark, transformed when he laughed. It was not quite softness. It was acknowledgement. In a world constructed to obliterate lineage, they constituted proof that blood continued to remember blood. That was the reason she remained alive, not for hope. Hope is too gentle a term for what sustained people breathing in places like Whitcomb Plantation, not for patience. Patience implies consent to waiting. Edna remained alive because one obligation persisted within her body. One final witness she refused to relinquish to the marketplace. Those surrounding her perceived something within her, though few comprehended it. The younger enslaved individuals knew she recalled names that no one else remembered. They claimed she could enumerate every child born in the quarters since 1798, and every child sold away afterward. They claimed she knew the locations of 2 bodies, interred near the old cypress ditch, bodies the owners never documented. They claimed she could identify each grave in the black burial ground beyond the pecan trees, even where the markers had decomposed down to soil. Some whispered that every master who had governed that place met an unusual end, and that Edna had stood near each funeral with the same inscrutable expression. People whisper when justice possesses no lawful form. In the main house, meanwhile, Elias Whitcomb consumed excessive brandy and spoke too freely. He was not elderly, 47 in 1859, but vice had begun eroding him. Cotton prices had turned unfavorable. Creditors pressed him from New Orleans. 2 mules were lame. 1 gin worker had fled. He complained incessantly about losses, as if a man who owned land, horses, silver, and 63 human beings could honestly speak of deprivation. Then, in late November, he began raising inquiries about the boy. What price could he command? Had he received proper training? Could he be dispatched with the January traders downriver? Such questions were never merely queries. On a plantation, they were warnings. A child's destiny frequently announced itself initially as arithmetic. Edna heard sufficient to recognize the contours of the danger, though no one addressed her directly. That, too, was part of slavery's arrogance. The conviction that those compelled to serve were too damaged to hear, too dim to comprehend, too old to signify. Yet, old age rendered her nearly invisible, and invisibility is the single weapon tyranny consistently hands to the people it despises. By Christmas week of 1859, while frost gathered pale along the fence rails each dawn, Mama Edna had begun observing more intently. She observed who entered the office after supper. She observed where Whitcomb stored the stable keys. She observed which wagon had been repaired for extended travel. She observed Josiah sleeping beneath the patched blanket, one arm draped over his face, still youthful enough to appear vulnerable in dreams. And somewhere behind her clouded eye and curved spine, behind the facade of an old woman, everyone had already entered in their minds. Something ancient and unconquered remained vigilant. The house believed it was devising plans for a sale. It did not yet comprehend that it was standing within the memory of a woman who had endured 103 years of robbery and had not forgotten how masters die. If you're listening from Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, or anywhere, history still leaves names unspoken. Comment where you're from and stay with this story, because what they dismissed as one old woman's final winter was, in truth, the reckoning they had been postponing for generations. By January 3, 1860, Whitcomb plantation had reverted to its customary ritual of cruelty. The bell rang before sunrise. Children transported water before their joints had warmed. Women bent over kettles and washboards in air sharp sufficient to split the skin. Men were enumerated, cursed, assigned, threatened. The main house smoked with breakfast, while the quarters smoked with hunger. Nothing in that order was accidental. Slavery survived not only through the whip, but through repetition. Render suffering routine, and the people who profit from it begin to label it management. Mama Edna recognized every sound of that system. She recognized the cough of the field hands before dawn, the iron scrape of bucket against well stone, the impatient bark of overseer Gideon Price when someone moved too slowly. She recognized the sound of a child attempting not to weep after being struck. She recognized the difference between wagon wheels prepared for cotton and wagon wheels prepared for sale. On a plantation, commerce had its own music, and the sale of human flesh had a particular rhythm. Inventory first, then inspection, then quiet conversation near the office door, then a forced calm that descended over the quarters like inclement weather. That week, the weather had already arrived. Josiah had been reassigned from stable work to heavier tasks near the loading yard, though no one provided a reason. That alone informed Edna sufficiently. A boy about to be sold was frequently rendered more visible in the final days. Owners like to observe posture, strength, obedience, teeth, shoulders, gait. They like to imagine themselves appraisers rather than traffickers. They would discuss a child's back the way a butcher discussed an animal's flank. They called it value. The truth was simpler. They were determining how much money could be extracted from suffering. Josiah was 12, but on paper he could be made 13 if that increased the price. He was listed as sound, robust, tractable when supervised. The record would not mention his mother's screams when she was sold in May 1856. It would not mention the scar across his left calf from a mule kick at age 8. It would not mention that he still woke some nights, believing he heard his sisters calling from the road. Ledgers do not record the soul because they cannot price what they intend to destroy. Edna observed him from the edge of the wash yard while she sorted torn shirts that would never truly be repaired. Her hands moved automatically. Her eyes did not. He carried feed sacks from the storehouse with the careful, measured strength of a child already taught that appearing weak invites punishment and appearing too strong invites sale. That was one of slavery's most vile lessons. A black child had to conceal his own body from the men who owned it. Hide health, hide spirit, hide intelligence, hide grief, hide anything that could be monetized or beaten. Childhood under such a system was not innocence. It was early discipline under surveillance. Whitcomb noticed him more with each passing day. From the gallery of the main house, Elias Whitcomb would stand with one hand inside his coat and the other around a glass, surveying the yard below. He possessed the fleshy, fading face of a man who inherited power without earning competence. His father, Nathaniel Whitcomb, had bequeathed him land, debt, and a practiced conviction that black lives were movable property. Elias had expanded the debt and diminished the land, but preserved the conviction. Men like him often failed upward. Their crops faltered, their books rotted, their drinking worsened. Yet the law still delivered them ownership over other human beings. That was the true obscenity of the age, incompetence enthroned on a foundation built by violence. On the afternoon of January 5, 1860, Edna heard the first thing she needed to hear. She was carrying kindling past the side passage near the office, bent low enough to seem not merely old, but absent. Inside, Whitcomb was speaking with a trader from Baton Rouge named Silas Mercer. Mercer had arrived in a dark coat with mud on the hem and a leather portfolio under one arm. He was the type produced by the domestic slave trade in abundance: clean cuffs, business tone, no visible blood on his hands, and therefore all the more culpable. Men like Mercer allowed the nation to pretend slavery was administration rather than organized predation. Edna slowed without appearing to stop. "Too small for field prime," Mercer remarked. "Not for long," Whitcomb replied. "Strong through the chest already. Good breeding stock if retained. Better return if moved now. No signs of decline." Breeding stock, that is how the record of American slavery must be read when spoken plainly. Not paternalism, not management, not civilization. A boy discussing feed in the yard. A man in the office discussing whether his body should be worked, sold, or used to generate more bodies for sale. Such language did not emerge from barbarism at the system's fringes. It occupied its center. Mercer asked, "Ain't he kin likely to cause trouble?" Whitcomb laughed. "Only an old grandmother near the grave already." Edna kept moving. Those words were sufficient. Not because they shocked her, but because they confirmed what she had feared since late November. A date had not yet been specified, but intention had. Josiah was no longer a possibility in Whitcomb's mind. He was merchandise under consideration. That night, the quarters were quieter than usual. People had learned to interpret danger without announcing that they perceived it. Silence was often the final dignity, remaining to the powerless. A mother would stir a pot excessively. A man would repair a harness twice. A child would avoid posing questions because children in bondage learned rapidly that answers could wound. Edna sat on a stool outside her cabin, wrapped in a gray shawl gone thin at the fold. The cold had settled deeply into her wrists. Josiah came to her after dark, carrying half a sweet potato wrapped in cloth. "You eat," he whispered. She shook her head and pushed it back toward him. He hesitated. "Miss Hester says a trader came." Miss Hester was not a miss by law, of course. She was an enslaved woman of about 60 who cooked in the main house and collected fragments of truth the way others collected pins. Edna looked at the boy for an extended moment. His face remained youthful in the firelight, too young for the fear already hardening behind his eyes. "Did you hear your name?" she asked. He nodded once. There are moments on plantations when lies become a cruelty of their own. False comfort can be a form of surrender. Edna had witnessed too many mothers promise children that sales would not occur, only to observe those children dragged screaming to wagons before noon. Therefore, she did not lie. The system had lied enough. "You listen now," she instructed him. "You listen to me harder than you ever listened before." He sat on the step at her feet. "If they move you, they move quickly. If they smile, it's ominous. If they wash you before sunup, it's ominous. If Mr. Whitcomb asks you questions gently, it's ominous. If a wagon waits empty near the office, it's ominous. Josiah remained silent. You do not display fear to Gideon Price. He delights in it. You do not speak back to Whitcomb. He seeks justification. You observe. You remember. And when I tell you to walk, you walk. When I tell you to run, you run. He looked up at her then, and for the first time the child allowed the truth to enter his face. You coming, too? The question lingered there between them, cruel in its innocence. Edna did not answer immediately. A lie would have been simpler. Truth, however, was the only thing slavery never deserved to keep concealed. I'm with you as far as I can go, she said. That was all. In the days that followed, she became more invisible intentionally. She allowed her shoulders to sag further when white eyes were near. She paused before stairs as though her knees might fail. She coughed into her sleeve at opportune moments. She repeated herself once or twice in front of Whitcomb's sister, Lavinia Bell Whitcomb, who had come from Bayou Sara after her husband's death, and now drifted through the house smelling of rosewater and judgment. Lavinia regarded Edna with the casual disgust of a woman who believed proximity to violence did not stain her, because she did not personally wield the whip. But women like Lavinia were not incidental to slavery. They maintained its rooms orderly, its children dressed, its conscience perfumed. They benefited from every sale and frequently pretended themselves innocent of the transaction. Why is that old thing still here? Lavinia inquired one morning over breakfast, as if commenting on broken furniture. Because burying her costs money. Whitcomb replied. They laughed. Such moments deserve to be remembered plainly. Not to indulge outrage theatrically, but to mark the moral fact. The institution was not merely in crisis, it was cruel in conversation. Casual cruelty, repeated daily, built the climate in which larger horrors seemed normal. Edna lowered her gaze and memorized the position of the office keys on the sideboard. 3 keys on a brass ring. 1 for the grain store. 1 for the ledger cabinet. 1, smaller and newer, for the rear gate beyond the stables. That gate mattered. It opened toward the old timber road, seldom used in winter. Most on the plantation had forgotten it because the hinge dragged and one post leaned badly after the 1857 storm. But forgotten routes are often the only routes the hunted can use. By January 8th, more pieces had fallen into place. Mercer returned. A bay gelding was given extra oats. 1 travel wagon was greased at the axle. Hester heard the date spoken in the pantry, January 14th before first light, 6 days. Edna did not panic. Panic is a luxury usually reserved for people who still believe someone might come rescue them. Enslaved people on isolated plantations knew better. There would be no sheriff to appeal to, no court to hear a grandmother's claim, no church elder to prevent a sale. The nation had arranged itself too meticulously against them. Whatever would be accomplished for Josiah would be accomplished by hands already designated for suffering. That evening, Edna opened the wooden box beneath her bed. Inside lay the remnants of a life white men had failed to obliterate entirely. A strip of blue cloth from her daughter Ruth Ann's dress, 2 brass buttons, a dried root bundle wrapped in paper, a tiny bone, handled knife worn dull with age, and a folded scrap on which names had been scratched over decades in charcoal and soot, then traced again when the letters faded. Children born, children sold, children dead. It was not a legal document. It was something more significant. It was a counter, record, a witness against erasure. She ran her thumb over the names until she found the final one still sleeping under her roof, Josiah. Then she closed the box and sat in the darkness. Outside, the plantation creaked in the winter wind like an ancient ship transporting its sins across water. Inside the main house, glasses clinked. Whitcomb laughed. Somewhere a baby coughed in the quarters. Somewhere a man prayed quietly enough that no overseer would hear. And Mama Edna, 103 years old, understood with the cold precision of extensive experience that the time for watching had nearly passed. Soon, she would have to begin. Long before Elias Whitcomb began pricing Josiah for sale, the plantation had already entered 6 masters, and Mama Edna had stood within sight of every coffin. That fact alone should halt any honest listener. In a slave society, old age among the enslaved was not common fortune. It was survival through attrition. It meant surviving fever, childbirth, hunger, punishments, exhaustion, winter exposure, summer rot, and the ordinary murderous carelessness of owners. To reach 103 in Louisiana was not simply rare. It was an indictment. It signified that one woman had endured long enough to observe generations of men proclaim themselves permanent, then vanish into earth. By January 1860, people in the quarters did not speak openly about the pattern, but they recognized it. They recognized the plantation had changed names, account books, and front porch furniture more frequently than it had changed Edna. They recognized fires, illnesses, drownings, falls, and unexplained deaths had visited the house in a sequence too orderly to ignore. They also recognized a truth enslaved people learned early. When justice cannot appear by law, it sometimes arrives wearing the face of accident. Edna had never confessed to anything. She had never needed to. The first master she outlived was Jeremiah Voss, who purchased her in 1768 when she was still a child, perhaps 11 years old, though the bill of sale listed her as 9. Slave traders and planters frequently reduced the age of black children on paper when it suited a buyer, just as they inflated strength and concealed illness when it suited a seller. Even the arithmetic was theft. Voss operated a smaller tract then, not yet the expanded Whitcomb property it would later become. He employed the lash personally. That should be stated plainly. Many men of that class concealed themselves behind overseers. Jeremiah Voss preferred direct humiliation. He believed fear worked best when delivered by the hand that claimed ownership. By 1774, Edna was strong enough for field labor and young enough to still be beaten for crying after dark. Voss derived satisfaction from that. Men like him mistook the visible performance of domination for moral authority. In August 1781, Voss died after 3 days of retching and fever. The white physician attributed it to spoiled pork and summer flux. The enslaved people remembered something else. The tea Edna had been ordered to carry to the porch after Voss whipped her mother nearly senseless for dropping a seed sack. No one observed her add anything. No one heard her speak. But old Aunt Nessa, who later died in the 1793 fever season, claimed Edna had begun learning roots long before white men noticed she could listen. That is how these stories survive, not through court testimony, but through the memory of those denied the right to testify. The second was Amos Voss, Jeremiah's son, who inherited the land in 1781 and doubled the number of enslaved people within a decade. He was the type slavery rewarded generously, less theatrical than his father, more systematic, more profitable, and therefore, in many ways, worse. He maintained neater books. He separated mothers from children with cleaner handwriting. He calculated breeding years, sale windows, and labor losses with the smooth tone of a merchant discussing weather. Civilization often conceals its ugliest crimes behind better bookkeeping. In April 1798, the West Barn burned just after midnight. Amos Voss had entered it drunk, shouting about thieves after hearing the horses kick against their stalls. By the time others reached the building, flame had already raced up the dry beams. 2 mules perished. Amos perished with them. The official account attributed it to a tipped lantern. Such incidents occurred frequently enough in timber country, but one detail remained fixed in the quarters for decades. Mama Edna, then around 41, had been observed earlier that evening near the tack room carrying ashes from the cook fire in a lidded pail. Again, no proof. Again, no confession, only sequence, only memory, only a fire that selected its victim better than chance usually does. The third was Elias Boone, a brother-in-law who assumed control after the Voss line thinned. Boone lasted from 1798 to 1807. He introduced stricter patrol discipline and hired slave catchers during harvest months. He acquired dogs. He sold children farther south than the previous owner had dared. Under Boone, the plantation became harsher, not because he was uniquely wicked, but because the expanding slave economy rewarded men for becoming more efficient predators. Cotton was spreading. Markets were hardening. Human cruelty was being professionalized. Boone disappeared in November 1807 on the Old River Road between Bayou Sara and the Landing. His horse returned first, lathered and riderless. Boone's hat was discovered in mud 2 days later. His body was recovered 6 days after that, half caught in a cypress brake, face ruined by water and root. White officials attributed it to a fall. Perhaps it was. But those who worked the stables remembered Boone's saddle strap had been replaced the day before by one of the yard women after Edna spent an unusual amount of time near the harness room, supposedly searching for a dropped shawl pin. Thus the whisper deepened, not with superstition, with pattern. The fourth master was Calvin Reed, who purchased the property in 1810 after debt proceedings unraveled Boone's estate. Reed lasted until 1821. He was a church-going planter, which in slave country frequently signified a man especially skilled at partitioning conscience from conduct. He contributed to missions, compelled enslaved people to attend Sunday readings, and lectured them on obedience from Scripture while authorizing floggings on Monday. No system produces hypocrisy more efficiently than one that requires Christians to explain why kidnapping is compatible with salvation. Reed died after being thrown from a horse on September 14, 1821. The animal was a black mare named Mercy, known to be steady and old. Yet that morning she reared violently near the drainage ditch below the Pecan Ridge, casting Reed headfirst onto a split stump. His skull fractured above the ear, dead before noon. Stable boy testimony, never entered into any official record, held that the mare had been skittish only after someone worked burrs beneath the saddle blanket and rubbed irritant along the inside strap. Stable boys notice such things. Their lives depend on noticing what white men dismiss. One of them, an enslaved teenager named Ben Kido, later informed his daughter that he had watched Edna calm the horse the night before, murmuring low, one hand under the jaw, the other adjusting something no one else observed. By then, Edna was already spoken of carefully, not feared exactly, revered too much to be feared in the ordinary sense. The elderly in the quarters had begun to regard her not as a victim who endured history, but as a witness history consistently underestimated. That distinction matters. Slaveholders survived by insisting the enslaved existed only as objects under power. The moment an enslaved woman became legible as a mind, a strategist, a keeper of reckoning, the fiction of total mastery began to crack. Then came Nathaniel Whitcomb, father of Elias, who assumed control in 1822 and governed until 1838. Nathaniel expanded the house, imported silver, and prided himself on order. He also sold Edna's daughter, June, to Mississippi in 1829 and whipped a pregnant woman to death in 1833 after accusing her of stealing dried meat. No court charged him. No church expelled him. That too must be remembered. Slave societies did not fail to punish such men by oversight. They were designed not to punish them. Nathaniel sickened in late July 1838. At first, it was stomach pain, then sweats, then convulsions. The white physician from Baton Rouge attributed it to tainted well water. Yet only one man, who drank daily from the house service, developed such symptoms. Nathaniel worsened after each dose of tonic, prepared under the supervision of the kitchen. Edna, by then 81, had not served in the kitchen for years. Too old, too stiff, too slow, so they claimed. But age made movement between cabins and outbuildings less suspicious, not more. Elderly people carrying herbs, cloth, or broth were scenery. Masters constructed their own blindness by ranking whose presence mattered. Nathaniel died on August 2, 1838, cursing the servants with his final clear breath. Edna washed his burial shirt. The sixth was Thomas Bell Whitcomb, Nathaniel's nephew by marriage, who held temporary control from 1838 until Elias consolidated title in 1844. Thomas was a gambler, a drinker, and a violent fool. If slavery preserved competent tyrants, it also preserved incompetent ones by giving them human beings to consume when everything else failed. Thomas lost money, horses, and patience in equal measure. In March 1841, after drunkenly accusing an enslaved carpenter named Isaiah Cole of theft, Thomas beat the man so severely he died 3 days later. 7 months afterward, Thomas himself was discovered in the lower canebrake, blue-faced, lips swollen, boots half off in the mud. Snake bite, the official story stated, and perhaps it was. Louisiana had sufficient cottonmouths to make the explanation plausible. But Hester, then still a young kitchen girl, would later recall seeing Edna dry a set of marsh reeds by the fire and tuck something wrapped in cloth into Thomas's riding boot after he passed out on the back gallery one evening. Again, no witness brave enough to speak openly. Again, no courtroom. Again, only the hard underground archive enslaved people maintained among themselves. Observation, sequence, motive, memory. By the time Elias Whitcomb stood at the head of the plantation in 1860, the meaning of all this had become impossible to miss for anyone willing to perceive it. Every master had fallen differently. Disease, fire, disappearance, a horse, poison, a bite. Separate events on paper. Together, a ledger of retaliation written in forms the law could not read, and at the edge of every entry stood the same old woman, aging, bent, silent, still alive. Silent. This is where sentimental storytellers typically err. They attempt to transform such a woman into folklore, a ghost before death, a myth of vengeance floating above the actual structure of slavery. But Edna was not a myth. She was the product of a system that taught enslaved people the anatomy of white power in intimate detail. What owners consumed, where they rode, when they slept, which keys they carried, what medicine they trusted, what vanity made them careless. Oppression educates the oppressed, though at a monstrous cost. The master imagines he is training obedience. Frequently, he is only teaching his victim where the joints of the machine are weakest. Edna had learned every joint. She never boasted. She never warned. She never claimed the dead as her work. That silence itself was discipline. To survive nearly a century under bondage required more than anger. It required timing. It required patience sharp enough to pass for frailty. It required understanding that justice in such a place could almost never arrive pure. It would come stained, indirect, deniable. And now, in January 1860, with Josiah marked for sale and Elias Whitcomb carrying his own arrogance like a lantern toward dry timber, all those buried years were no longer merely memory. They were instruction. On January 9, 1860, the threat ceased being rumor and became schedule. That is how slavery frequently moved. Not as sudden chaos, but as administration. A child was not stolen in a burst of passion. He was entered into conversation, then into arithmetic, then into timing. The wagon was checked. The buyer was notified. The body was observed. The kin were ignored. By the time the victim understood the full shape of it, the transaction was already halfway complete. That is why the language of sale must never be softened. This was not commerce in any moral sense. It was abduction under paperwork. Mama Edna understood that by noon on the same day, Hester slipped the truth to her behind the smokehouse. Saturday before first light, Hester whispered, keeping her back turned as if she were only sorting onion skins. Mistrit. Mercer taking the boy downriver. Baton Rouge first, then likely New Orleans. January 14th, 1860. 5 days. That was the date Elias Whitcomb had chosen to sever the final living branch of Edna's family tree. Hester did not look at her. Enslaved people frequently learned to deliver the worst truths, with their faces arranged in ordinary shapes. Panic could be punished. Sorrow could be noticed. Even love could expose a plan before it began. "You sure?" Edna asked. Hester nodded once. Miss Lavinia inquired whether the boy had a decent shirt fit for inspection. Inspection. Another word the system employed to dress up obscenity. A child washed, dressed, turned, examined, discussed, teeth checked, arms felt, scars noted, temper guessed at, then valued. White society had produced a complete ceremonial language for violating the body while pretending it remained respectable. Edna said nothing further. She returned to the wash yard and sat with a bundle of worn linen on her lap, her hands still, her eyes open. To anyone glancing her way, she appeared old, tired, almost absent. But age had not hollowed her, it had sharpened her by removal. At 103, she no longer squandered strength on illusion. She perceived the thing clearly. Josiah would be sold south unless something interrupted the order of events. And on plantations, only force or cunning ever interrupted anything. The current master, Elias Whitcomb, had already settled the matter in his own mind. He required money. Cotton had disappointed in 1859. A note in New Orleans had come due in December. One creditor, Auguste Brissac, had written twice. Another had dispatched a man to Bayou Sara. Whitcomb's wife had been deceased since 1857. His drinking had worsened, and his household had become looser, meaner. Less disciplined in the way decaying power frequently becomes. But decline does not render a slaveholder less dangerous. It typically renders him more willing to consume whatever human value remains nearby. Josiah, at 12, represented liquidity. That is the word men like Whitcomb would not utter aloud in front of ladies, though it governed their behavior all the same. When a plantation owner spoke of managing assets or balancing losses, somewhere beneath that language sat a child about to be torn from everyone who loved him. By January 10th, the signs multiplied. Lavinia Whitcomb ordered warm water heated before dawn for the stable boy. Mercer's name was mentioned twice in the pantry. Gideon Price, the overseer, instructed Josiah to remain near the yard and not wander toward the timber line. A spare wagon harness was brought down from the loft. No one announced a sale. They did not need to. Plantations trained the enslaved to read danger in logistics. Josiah himself understood more than the adults wanted him to. That was another theft slavery committed. It forced children into knowledge before they had any defense against it. On the evening of January 10th, he came to Edna's cabin later than usual. His jaw tight, his hands raw from labor. Mr. Price asked if I could lift grain sacks clear to the wagon rail. He said. Edna looked up from the stool where she sat rubbing tallow into a cracked shoe sole.
"What'd you say?" "That I could." "You smile." "No." "You talk too much."
He stood there in the half-darkness waiting. Then he posed the question he had already been asking with his eyes for days. "They selling me for certain?" This time Edna did not soften it.
"Yes."
He turned away immediately, not out of disrespect, but because boys his age still believed turning their face could conceal pain. It cannot. Not from a grandmother. Not from anyone who has had pain used as a language around her for nearly a century. The cabin went quiet, except for the sound of wind slipping through the board seams. When he finally spoke again, his voice had gone flatter. "We're Downriver first. Maybe New Orleans. Maybe farther. He nodded once. There are truths too immense for a child, and yet forced onto children every day by wicked institutions. This was one of them. Sail did not merely mean distance. It meant probable disappearance. Baton Rouge could become New Orleans. New Orleans could become a trader's yard. A trader's yard could become sugar country. And sugar country could become a grave. Few systems in the modern world consumed life more efficiently than the lower South sugar plantations. The domestic slave trade fed them steadily. Children taken there were frequently not being relocated. They were being delivered to shortened futures. Edna knew that. That was why her thoughts, once settled, grew cold and practical. She began to examine the plantation not as home, because it had never been that, but as terrain. Whitcomb Plantation sat on a low rise above winter mud and cane brake, with the main house facing east toward the main road. The slave quarters stood beyond the wash yard and smokehouse. The stable and carriage shed formed a rough line behind the house and beyond them, half neglected since the storm season of 1857, was the rear gate, narrow iron-latched, opening toward the old timber road that curved north before splitting west toward a free black settlement rumor. Said still sheltered runaways from time to time. Rumor was not certainty, but certainty was for people protected by law. Enslaved people survived by using rumor as map prayer and wager all at once. She began observing who controlled what. Whitcomb kept the office keys by day, and after supper frequently laid them on the sideboard near the dining room decanter. Gideon carried the stable ring. Lavinia noticed everything involving Lenin's and children's appearance, but understood little of roads or labor. Mercer, when present, preferred to sleep near the front room and depart before dawn. The dogs were chained farther from the rear yard than they had been in previous years. Because Elias complained their noise disturbed his sleep, each detail mattered. Oppressed people are frequently accused by the powerful of scheming, as if cunning were a character flaw rather than a survival response. But what is a grandmother to do when the law protects the thief? The preacher blesses the thief. The sheriff dines with the thief. And the market rewards the thief. Moral lectures sound cleaner in safe rooms than they do in cabins where children are about to be sold. Edna had no access to righteous institutions. She had only observation, memory, and whatever remained in her old hands. On January 11th, she observed Whitcomb in the medicine room. He had developed a cough during the damp cold spell and took nightly laudanum in drops, always mixed in warmed wine by Lavinia's instruction. The bottle sat in a walnut cabinet above the pantry shelf, beside camphor, calomel, and castor oil. Edna observed where Lavinia placed the cabinet key after use, under the folded inventory book, second shelf down. That same afternoon, she noticed Gideon Price hang the rear stable key on a peg while assisting a farrier reset a shoe on the bay gelding Mercer favored for travel. He intended to retrieve it. Then Whitcomb summoned him to the porch, and the key remained hanging there nearly 7 minutes. 7 minutes can alter a life if someone has waited long enough. Edna did not move then, not yet, but she noted the negligence. White men in power frequently confuse routine with security. They believe domination has rendered them safe, when it has only rendered them predictable. By nightfall, she had determined the truth no one else dared utter aloud. If Josiah waited to be taken, he was lost. If she waited for mercy, she was a fool. If she moved too soon, both of them would be crushed. Timing, then, would be everything. She began to gather words as carefully as other people gathered tools. Not many. Only to those who still trusted her enough to hear without flinching. Hester in the kitchen, old Caleb near the mule pen, who had once driven timber north and knew the back tracks beyond the creek. Dinah Reed in the washhouse, whose niece lived 2 plantations over, and sometimes passed messages under baskets of lye soap. Edna did not disclose to them a complete plan. Full plans are dangerous under slavery because captured people bleed details under pressure. She provided them with fragments. Watch the dogs. Notice if Mercer arrives early. Learn whether the trader rides with 1 horse or 2. Ask whether the river road is being patrolled after Sunday. Fragment by fragment, she constructed the edges of what might become escape. Meanwhile, the threat drew nearer. On January 12th, Whitcomb summoned Josiah onto the main porch. Edna was in the yard, carrying split wood, and heard sufficient. "Stand straight," Whitcomb instructed. The boy obeyed. "Turn." He turned. "How old are you?" 12, sir." "Strong for 12." No answer. Whitcomb stepped closer. "You obedient?" "Yes, sir." This was the obscenity in its naked form. A white man appraising a black child's body and temperament for sale, with no shame because the entire structure around him had taught him he need not possess any. It is important not to look away from such scenes or dilute them with gentler vocabulary. Slavery was not tragic misunderstanding. It was repeated, legal, intimate violation. Whitcomb informed Gideon later that afternoon, "Wash him Saturday and keep him quiet Friday night." Keep him quiet. Children on the eve of sale frequently became restless, sick, silent, or desperate. Owners interpreted such responses as inconvenience. They never called it what it was: terror caused by a system they maintained deliberately. Josiah heard sufficient to understand the finality of it. That night, he did not sleep in his own bunk space, with the boys near the stable loft. He came instead to Edna's cabin and sat on the floor beside her bed, wrapped in the patched blanket that had once belonged to his mother. "You ever think my mama's still alive?" he asked. Edna stared ahead into the darkness. Ruth Ann had been sold in May 1856 to a trader heading toward Point Coupee, then likely farther. No verified word had ever returned. In slave country, absence was often the only message permitted. "I think she wanted you alive," Edna said. He swallowed and nodded. After a while he asked, "You scared?"
Yes.
Edna said. That answer mattered. Courage told falsely becomes theater. Real courage admits fear and proceeds anyway. The old woman did not pose as iron. She was tired, hurting, cold, and almost out of years. But she had crossed too much death to mistake fear for a command to surrender. Outside, the plantation settled into late, night quiet. Somewhere near the house, a shutter knocked in the wind. The dogs shifted chain and then stilled. From the main house came one final burst of male laughter, then silence. Edna listened to all of it and counted. 3 nights remaining. The threat was no longer approaching. It was inside the yard, inside the office, inside the key rings, inside the medicine cabinet, inside the trader's schedule, inside the way Whitcomb looked at the boy. And because it was now fully visible, it had become something else as well, a deadline. By January 12, 1860, Mama Edna had ceased hoping for interruption from outside the plantation. That is one of the hardest truths slavery teaches. No one is coming unless the trapped create movement for themselves. The law was not broken by the sale of Josiah. The law existed to protect it. The church would not intervene. The sheriff would not object. White neighbors might gossip over the price, but not over the crime. A boy could be torn from his family before dawn, and by breakfast the district would label it ordinary business. That was the moral architecture of the slave South. Evil made procedural, then renamed necessity. So Edna prepared. Not dramatically, not recklessly, not like a younger person with strength to waste. She prepared like someone who had survived 103 years by understanding that power notices noise first and meaning later. Her age, her limp, her bent shoulders, her dimmed right eye, all of it had become camouflage. White people on the plantation saw weakness where there was discipline. They saw decline where there was calculation. They thought old age had stripped her down to habit. In truth, habit was the weapon. On the morning of Thursday, January 12th, she began with the medicine. The house had been using a walnut cabinet in the pantry passage for years. Lavinia kept laudanum, camphor, castor oil, calomel, and tinctures there, wrapped in neat domestic order, as if poison became respectable when arranged on polished shelves. Elias Whitcomb took drops of laudanum at night for his cough and nerves, always with warmed wine. Gideon Price sometimes used the liniment for his shoulder. No one imagined that an old enslaved woman passing with folded linens might be studying which bottle sat where. Edna had already observed Lavinia slide the little cabinet key beneath the inventory ledger. That morning, while Lavinia scolded Dina Reed over missing tea cloths and Hester was occupied with biscuit dough, Edna moved through the pantry with a basket of mending. She paused only once, bent as if her back had caught. Her hand disappeared under the ledger and emerged with the key. A small motion, nothing theatrical. Theft under slavery was frequently labeled sin when committed by the enslaved, though their entire condition was built on theft from them. Let the moral record remain straight. Reclaiming leverage inside a stolen world is not equivalent to the original crime. She opened the cabinet. Not long enough. She did not empty bottles or create some foolish obvious sabotage. She was too experienced for that. She shifted amounts. A little less in one vial, a little more in another. A stopper exchanged, a paper wrapping reversed. Sufficient to confuse, delay, weaken, or cloud judgment when the hour arrived. She had no need for perfection. Under pressure, even minor disorder in a master's comforts could produce useful openings. Then she closed the cabinet, returned the key, and resumed mending. By noon, she had moved on to the second necessity, steel. The knife in her wooden box was too small and too worn to trust in a final struggle. What she required was not a grand weapon, but a useful one. Something to cut rope, pry a latch, threaten if needed, finish a task quickly. Slavery taught the enslaved to improvise from improvisum, whatever the masters overlooked. That afternoon, she made her way toward the smokehouse yard, carrying a broken pail handle as excuse. Near the butcher block, tucked behind stacked split logs, Caleb Morrow had left what she had requested without being observed, handing it to her. A narrow skinning knife, sharpened on one side, wrapped in a rag dark with old grease. Caleb was around 68 in 1860, a mule handler whose knees had gone bad, but whose memory remained exact. He had driven timber roads in the 1830s. He knew where creek beds crossed trails and which fences rotted first after rain. He also knew the discipline of silence. He did not look at her when she passed him near the mule pen, only muttered, "North track still firmer than River Road." That was all. Fragments. Never a complete plan. This is how oppressed communities survive surveillance. By distributing knowledge in pieces small enough to protect the whole if any one person is broken open by force. White authorities labeled this deceit. It was not deceit. It was intelligence under occupation. Edna slid the knife into the lining seam of her mattress tick until nightfall. The third necessity was keys. Gideon Price had grown careless from repetition. He treated the rear stable key as utility, not vulnerability. On Thursday evening, while assisting the farrier settle a restless bay gelding, he again left the ring on the peg inside the tack shed. This time Edna was prepared. She entered with harness scraps in a basket, moving slowly enough to appear almost lost. Her hand brushed the peg. The key ring vanished into cloth for perhaps 10 seconds. Long enough for her fingers to test shape, weight, and order. Long enough to confirm which one matched the rear gate latch she had studied from afar. Then it was back in place before Gideon turned. She did not need to steal the ring that night. She only required certainty. That is another lesson old people know better than the young. Do not take the thing too early. Learn it first. Greed for immediate control ruins more desperate plans than fear does. By sunset, Edna had gathered what mattered most. The medicine cabinet could be disturbed, a blade could be concealed, and the rear gate could be opened with the smaller iron key, hanging second from the split ring. Now she required bodies, not many, only trustworthy ones. That evening she spoke first to Hester Bell in the kitchen yard. While carrying onion peelings to the refuse pit, Hester was about 59, broad-shouldered, sharp-minded, and careful with her face. She had spent decades hearing what the White family said when they believed servants ceased existing after dark. "Traders sleep here Friday?" Edna asked. Hester kept her eyes on the bucket in her hand. "Likely. Front room if rain comes. A Mr. Whitcomb drinking heavy. Every night. Dogs. Chained south side still. Lavinia complains of barking." Edna nodded once. Then quieter. "Friday after supper you keep her busy." Hester did not ask how. She only said, "Can do." That same night, Edna found Dinah Reed behind the washhouse rubbing cracked hands with lard to prevent the skin from splitting in the cold. Dinah's niece, Lottie, worked on the neighboring fruit place and sometimes carried whispers between plantations under bundles of pressed shirts. "Anyone North Road?" Edna asked. Dinah answered immediately. "Patrol seen Tuesday." "Not since." "Fruit people still leave corn sacks by the old cut." A pause. "Sometimes." That meant sufficient, not safety. Nothing like safety, but perhaps a place where a running child could find water or cover before dawn. Finally, just before full dark, she sat near Josiah by the ash pit as if warming her hands. "Tomorrow you do like always," she told him. "You limp some if you can." He frowned. "Why?" "So they think you tired." He understood. "Hide strength, again. You eat what you can Friday," she said. "Don't leave scraps like you're nervous. Don't watch the road. Don't stare at Mercer." His voice dropped. "Tomorrow night?" Edna's eyes remained on the ash. "When I come get you, no questions." He swallowed.
"Yes, Mom."
No embrace followed. That matters. People imagine grand declarations before acts of escape. Plantations did not allow for theatrics. Love had to compress itself into instructions. A grandmother instructed a child how to survive in the grammar the system left available. By Friday, January 13th, 1860, the plantation had tightened with the sick calm that precedes a legal crime. Mercer arrived before noon in a mud-splashed wagon with a rolled blanket, a ledger case, and a short whip at his belt. He ate at the main table that evening with Elias and Lavinia while Hester served stew and hot bread. Edna moved once through the dining room, carrying wood to the side hearth, and observed sufficient. Elias flushed with drink, Mercer composed. Lavinia tense about appearances, Gideon eating in the passage and observing the weather through the back window. It might rain after midnight. That could assist. Rain softened tracks, muffled sound, shortened tempers, and made white men slower to leave warm rooms. It also rendered roads treacherous. Escape under slavery never offered clean choices. Every possible advantage arrived tied to another danger. Later, Edna took her place in the pantry passage with folded linens and waited until Lavinia requested more wine to be warmed for Elias's cough. Hester poured from the bottle. Lavinia added the laudanum by habit, but habit had already been tampered with. The measure was incorrect now. Not sufficient to kill quickly, perhaps not sufficient to kill at all, but sufficient to deepen confusion, thicken limbs, delay response. Edna was not constructing a single point of failure. She was weaving inconvenience into weakness, weakness into delay, delay into opportunity. That is what a powerless strategist does. She does not gamble on miracles. She multiplies chances. The house settled after 10:00. Mercer took the front room. Lavinia retired upstairs. Elias consumed one more glass than usual. Gideon checked the stable and cursed the cold. In the quarters, no one spoke loudly. A few knew sufficient to remain wakeful. Most knew only that something ominous was near. That, too, was common under slavery. Terror traveled faster than information. Edna returned to her cabin and opened the wooden box one final time. Inside lay the strip of blue cloth from Ruth Ann's dress, the brass buttons, the root bundle, the suit-marked list of names. Children born, children sold, children dead. She touched them not like relics, but like witnesses. The South maintained deeds, bills of sale, inventories, and account books. The enslaved maintained memory, and memory, though fragile, can become a sharper record than any courthouse ledger when the courthouse itself is corrupt. She folded the strip of blue cloth into her dress. Then she drew out the skinning knife and secured it under her petticoat along her calf. Then, with hands swollen by age and cold, she tore a narrow strip from an old feed sack and wound it around her left ankle for support. She would need to walk farther and faster than her body preferred. Pain could be relied upon. Strength could not. Preparation meant admitting that plainly. Outside, wind pressed damp against the cabin walls. Somewhere near the house, a shutter clicked. The dogs shifted once, then quieted. The night had that particular stillness winter nights in Louisiana sometimes carry before rain. Heavy, listening, almost swollen with what is about to occur. Edna sat on the stool beside her bed and waited until the plantation slipped into its deepest sleep. No prayer escaped her lips. Not because she lacked belief, but because belief under slavery had long ago learned not to advertise itself before action. What she possessed now was not hope in the soft sense. It was resolve old and stripped to bone. Aged hands, a hidden blade, a disturbed medicine cabinet, a known key, a child warned to be prepared, a few trusted people holding pieces of the darkness. White power had mistaken her invisibility for harmlessness. By the time the house understood otherwise, she intended the night to already be in motion. Just after midnight on January 14, 1860, the plantation entered the hour when slaveholders felt safest. That hour mattered. A house built on forced labor always depends on routines of false security. The master drinks, the trader sleeps, the overseer loosens his vigilance. The dogs settle into their chain radius, the lamps burn lower, and the enslaved are expected to remain exactly where power has placed them. That expectation is the quiet engine of the whole system. Slavery could not function by whip alone. It required confidence that fear had accomplished most of the work already. That night, Mama Edna intended to break that confidence. Rain had not yet fully arrived, but the air was wet and heavy, and a low wind moved through the pecan trees behind the main house. The yard was dark except for the porch lamp and the weaker glow leaking from the pantry passage. Inside, Elias Whitcomb had taken his evening wine with the altered drops Lavinia measured by habit. Not sufficient to drop him dead on the spot. That was never the objective. Edna had not constructed her final move on a miracle. She had constructed it on confusion, delay, softened reflex, thickened thought. In a world where every open path was guarded by someone stronger, elderly people learned to value minutes more than force. By 12:30, the house was quiet. Mercer slept in the front room, boots by the door, coat over the chair, one hand near the small traveling pistol he maintained in his satchel. Gideon Price had completed a final round of the stable and gone to his pallet off the carriage shed. Lavinia's room above the east hall was dark. Whitcomb's cough, which usually cracked twice or three times after drink, came only once and then dissolved into a long silence. Edna rose from her stool in the cabin with the care of a person whose bones argued with every movement. Josiah was already awake. He had not slept properly. No child on the edge of sail ever did. He sat upright under the patched blanket, boots on, eyes wide in the darkness. When Edna touched his shoulder, he stood immediately. No questions. Good. She tied her shawl tighter under her chin, checked the knife concealed along her calf, and listened one final time. The quarters were mostly still. Somewhere a baby shifted and whimpered, then settled. Somewhere a man cleared his throat in his sleep. The old boards of the cabin emitted one soft complaint under her foot. Then she opened the door. The cold struck first. Wet, thin, bitter cold. Louisiana cold does not always freeze the earth, but it can still enter old joints like punishment. Edna stepped out anyway, Josiah behind her. Both of them hugging the shadow line between the wash yard and the dark edge of the smokehouse. This was the route she had measured in her head. Not across the open yard. Never the open yard. Along the side of the wash shed, behind the rain barrel, past the stacked split wood. Then the narrow strip of darkness behind the smokehouse, toward the stable line. From there to the tack shed, then the rear gate beyond the carriage track, then the timber road. Simple in memory, dangerous in flesh. Oppression frequently appears total in daylight. At night, it reveals seams, but only for those willing to move through them, with their whole body on the line. Josiah followed well, too well perhaps. He had learned the silence of hunted children early. At 12, he already understood how to place his feet on packed earth rather than loose gravel. How to duck instinctively at a white man's silhouette. How to breathe through fear without allowing it to rise into sound. No child should know such things. Yet the slave South trained black children in concealment as if it were ordinary development. That fact alone condemns the entire order more thoroughly than any speech from a courtroom ever could. They reached the back of the smokehouse. Edna paused and listened. No dog alarm. Good. Hester had performed her part earlier in the evening, slipping marrow bones and kitchen scraps toward the south chain posts. The dogs would not remain quiet forever, but full dogs bark later. In places built on surveillance, even hunger could be utilized against the watchers. They moved again. Near the stable wall, the mud deepened. Josiah nearly slipped once, caught himself on the rough plank siding, and froze. Edna turned, lifted one finger, and waited until his breath steadied. Her own ankle was already burning beneath the cloth wrap. She ignored it. Ahead, the tack shed loomed as a block of blackness against the even darker tree line. The key peg was just inside the side opening. This was the riskiest piece so far. If Gideon had altered routine, if he had taken the ring to his palate, if a horse snorted too loudly, if Mercer rose to relieve himself, the entire undertaking could collapse before they ever touched the gate. Escape under slavery was frequently less a clean act than a chain of near failures strung together by nerve. Edna stepped into the tack shed. Leather, hay, damp iron, horse breath. The peg was there, the ring too. Her fingers closed over cold metal, testing by touch. First the broad grain key, then the cabinet shape, then the smaller iron one she had memorized. She took only that one and left the ring hanging. No clatter, no rush. When she turned back, Josiah was no longer looking at her. He was staring toward the main house. At first, Edna heard nothing. Then it came, a muffled crash from inside, somewhere near the dining room or pantry passage. Glass, perhaps, or a chair overturning. Then a woman's voice upstairs. Lavinia, sharp, startled, angry. The house had begun to stir, not fully, not coherently, but the disorder Edna had sound was moving through it now. Perhaps Whitcomb had attempted to stand too rapidly and stumbled. Perhaps he had knocked over the sideboard, reaching for more drink. Perhaps Lavinia had discovered the bottle and the measure incorrect. Perhaps Mercer, light sleeper that he was, had heard movement where none should be. Cause hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that the great machine of routine had begun to misfire. Edna pressed the small key into the latch of the rear gate. For one terrible second, it resisted. Rust, swollen wood, winter damp. She turned harder. The iron yielded with a wet scrape. Too loud. A horse in the stable shifted and stamped. Another snorted. From the carriage shed came Gideon's voice, thick with sleep and irritation.
What's that?
No time remaining now. Edna pulled the gate inward and pushed Josiah through. Run north till the road bends, she whispered. Then wait in the trees. He hesitated. That hesitation was love. It was also danger. Go, she said. This time with the old force still buried within her voice. He went. Edna followed, dragging the gate most of the way closed behind her, but not fully latching it. Let them waste seconds on confusion. Let them wonder whether it had blown open or been opened. Seconds were life. They moved onto the timber road, little more than a dark cut through wet brush and winter weed. Bare branches reached overhead. Water stood in shallow ruts. The ground sucked at Edna's worn shoes. Josiah, lighter and longer-legged, could have vanished ahead in moments if he chose, but he kept checking back, slowing, waiting, his whole body fighting the instinct to obey her previous command and save himself first. That too was family. Slavery had attempted for generations to break it. It had failed more frequently than its defenders acknowledged. Behind them, the plantation came alive. A shout from the house, then another. Then Gideon Price, clear and furious now. Boys gone. No mention yet of Edna. They still counted her last, if at all. A lantern flared somewhere behind the stable line. Another answered near the porch. Dogs began barking from the south chain posts, late and confused, their alarm thrown off by scent, scraps, and rain, heavy air. Mercer's voice rose above the others, clipped and practical, calling for horses. That was when the second disturbance struck. From the main house came the unmistakable sound of breaking wood, followed by a man's cry cut short. Whitcomb. The old pattern had returned, though not in the exact shape the rumors preferred. There was no need for legend. Disorder alone, carefully timed, can make arrogant men destroy themselves. A half-drugged planter stumbling in a dark hall reaching for control, colliding with his own furniture and glass and flame. That is not supernatural justice. It is the natural consequence of a life built on command, suddenly deprived of obedience. Still, the cries from the house transformed everything. Now the pursuit would be more frantic, not less. A cornered system becomes most violent when it senses both humiliation and loss. Edna and Josiah had made it perhaps 200 yards up the timber road when her ankle betrayed her. Pain shot up her leg so sharply she nearly collapsed. She caught herself against a low pine, breath tearing in her chest. Josiah returned at once. "No," she said. "You can't walk fast enough." "I can walk enough." But that was no longer true, not at the speed required. Ahead, the road bent left toward thicker timber and a narrow run of water Caleb had described. Beyond that, if the darkness held and no patrol crossed, there might be the old cutbank trail. There might be Prout land. There might be cover. Behind, lanterns bobbed through the rear yard. Voices spread wider now. Gideon was organizing the search with the confidence of a man accustomed to hunting people for a living. Mercer had likely taken the bay gelding. Whitcomb, if still on his feet at all, would want the boy back not only for money now, but for pride. Slaveholders could tolerate many forms of suffering more calmly than they could tolerate defiance. Edna understood the arithmetic instantly. If they remained together, both might be captured. If the boy kept slowing for her, he was finished. If the searchers observed two sets of movement, they would follow the slower one and overtake both. She gripped Josiah's arm hard enough to make him face her. You listen now." He was breathing fast, eyes bright with panic, rain or sweat already gathering at his hairline. "When they come, they look for both. You make them wrong." He shook his head before she even finished. "No. You go when I say. I'm not leaving you." Every enslaved elder knew this agony. Teaching children survival frequently meant teaching them a cruelty that love itself resisted. But sentiment had never shielded black families in the plantation South. Only action, concealment, deception, endurance. The system depended on tenderness becoming hesitation. Edna could not permit that. Behind them, closer now, a rider cursed as a horse fought the mud near the rear gate. Gideon shouted, "North Road." They had been observed, or guessed correctly. Either was sufficient. Edna pulled Josiah off the main track into the brush line and shoved him toward the darker trees ahead. "Creek Bend," she hissed, "then west. Don't stop for me. Don't call back. Don't turn around unless you want chains." The boy's face fractured then, not into tears exactly, but into the raw shape of a child forced too quickly into a choice no child should face. Edna heard the riders approaching through the gate, heard Mercer's horse, heard the chain of the dogs dragged loose at last, heard the entire plantation, that polished apparatus of ownership, throwing itself into motion to reclaim what it considered stolen property. And in that black, wet stretch of road north of the main house, with the pursuit closing and the old woman's body nearly spent, the escape ceased being a plan and became something harsher. A separation, a sacrifice already approaching its name. By approximately 1:40 in the morning on January 14, 1860, the chase had narrowed to a strip of timber road, a failing old woman, and a boy the law insisted was saleable property. That is the point where every polite description of slavery collapses. No euphemism survives contact with the image itself. Mounted white men pursuing a black child through winter mud so he can be sold away before dawn. No language about the times, the economy, or inheritance can cleanse that fact. This was not a flawed institution. It was organized predation, defended by custom, court, and gun. Mama Edna heard them before she saw them. Gideon Price in front, because he knew the north track better than the others. Silas Mercer behind him on the bay gelding, because traders always rode, as if the human being fleeing them were merchandise trying to spoil. And Elias Whitcomb somewhere farther back, slower, unsteady, but driven now by something more inflamed than profit, humiliation. Slaveholders frequently reacted more violently to disobedience than to financial loss. A stolen horse could be replaced. A resisting black child challenged the fiction on which the whole order rested. Josiah was still beside her in the brush line, chest heaving, face fixed in panic and refusal. "No," he whispered. "I'm not leaving you." Edna turned and struck him once across the cheek, not from anger, from necessity. The blow was light by plantation standards and devastating by family standards. It shocked him still. That was the objective. A child in terror will cling to love even when love must become command. "You listen to me now," she said, voice low and hard. "You run to live. That is what your mama would tell you. That is what I'm telling you. You let me do what old people are for." He stared at her stunned, breath shaking. Behind them, a rider crashed through a shallow rut and cursed. Lantern light bounced against tree trunks. The dogs were still farther back, confused by mud and cross scent, but they would not remain confused forever. Edna shoved the boy toward the deeper dark where the road dipped toward the creek bend Caleb had described. "West after the water," she said. "Follow the pine break. If you see the old cut bank, keep left. If men call soft, don't answer. If they promise food, don't answer. If they say my name, don't answer." Such instructions existed because slavery had taught children what lies sounded like. Think on that. A civilization calling itself Christian required black grandmothers to teach children how not to be tricked back into bondage by false kindness in the dark. Josiah's mouth opened once more, perhaps to utter her name, perhaps to promise return. Edna did not allow it. Go. This time he went. He vanished, not like a hero from a story, but like a hunted child, fast, low, terrified, silent. Branches snapped softly, then less, then not at all. Within seconds, the darkness swallowed him. Edna stepped back onto the timber road alone. That choice must be marked clearly. She did not merely fall behind. She did not fail to keep pace. She chose the road. She chose visibility. She chose to become the thing the pursuers could find. That is what sacrifice appears as in actual history. Not speeches, not music. A bent woman with a ruined ankle positioning herself where violence will strike first. Gideon observed her almost immediately. "There," he shouted. "Old woman." The relief in his voice was ugly and unmistakable. Hunters like Gideon Price preferred targets they believed they could dominate quickly. He reined hard, lantern swinging, horse snorting steam into the wet dark. Mercer came up on his right, scanning the tree line for the boy. "Where is he?" Mercer barked. Edna said nothing. Gideon dismounted and crossed the mud in 3 long strides. He grabbed her by the shawl and yanked her half off balance. The old cloth tightened against her throat. Her feet slid. Pain shot up her wrapped ankle, but she remained upright. Where'd he go? No answer. He shook her harder. It should be stated plainly that men like Gideon were not incidental to the system. They were its practical hands. History too frequently remembers the plantation owner by name and lets the overseer blur into the background. But slavery required such men willing to hunt, strike, threaten, separate, and drag bodies without even the hypocrisy of paternal language. Mercer interjected. "Boy can't be far. Search the creek." Then, from farther back on the road, came Whitcomb's voice. "Hold her." He emerged on foot rather than horseback, coat half buttoned. One side of his face bloodied from the disturbance at the house. Whether he had fallen against a cabinet or cut himself on broken glass no longer mattered. He appeared less like a master than a damaged man furious that reality had disobeyed him. He stopped 3 paces from Edna and stared. So, this at last was the confrontation the plantation had spent years not noticing. The old woman they labeled unfit. The owner who thought age meant harmlessness. The final grandson already moving beyond their reach, if she could keep them here long enough. "You did this," Whitcomb declared. Edna's face did not change. He took 1 step closer. How many times, old woman? There it was. Not proof. Recognition. Somewhere within him, perhaps long buried under brandy and arrogance, the pattern had finally arranged itself. 6 dead masters, fire, fever, fall, disappearance, poison, bite, and always Edna remaining. Slaveholders frequently prided themselves on perceiving through everyone around them, yet routinely failed to comprehend the people they oppressed until the reckoning touched their own skin. Edna looked directly at him. For a second, perhaps the first genuine second in all the years he had known her, Whitcomb perceived not a servant, not a relic, not a bent domestic shadow, but a mind that had been measuring men like him for longer than he had been alive. "You buried your own kind," she said. The words landed harder than a confession would have, not because they explained the past fully, but because they named the deeper truth. Men like Whitcomb always believed violence entered history from below, from rebellion, from crime, from black rage. But slavery's dead were authored first by the masters themselves. Every coffin on that plantation had been constructed in a moral world those men created. Whitcomb's mouth tightened. "Where is the boy?" Edna allowed the silence to lengthen. That silence purchased time. Mercer was already dispatching 1 rider toward the creek run. another toward the west break. Gideon kept a fist twisted in her shawl. But none of them had yet discovered direction. Uncertainty was still operating. Each second widened the darkness around Josiah. Whitcomb struck her. Her head snapped sideways. Blood touched her lip. Again, no romance here. Not noble tableau. Just the ordinary brutality of a slaveholder striking an old black woman because he believed possession entitled him to answers. He raised his hand again. This time Edna moved. Age had taken strength, not instinct. Her right hand dropped under her skirt, discovered the hidden knife, and rose swiftly. Not for Whitcomb's throat, which a younger arm might have selected, but lower, inward, where she understood surprise would matter more than force. The blade drove into the flesh just above his hip. Whitcomb screamed. Gideon lunged. Mercer swore. The horse reared sideways. Lantern light pitched wild across trunks and mud. Edna did not attempt a second strike. She knew better. Her task was not to triumph. It was to rupture pursuit. Whitcomb doubled, clutching his side, cursing, stumbling backward into Gideon, and nearly bringing both men down in the muck. For 3 or 4 seconds, perhaps 5, the road dissolved into confusion, horse hooves slipping. Mercer shouting for light, Gideon attempting to hold both the bleeding master and the old woman. Whitcomb shrieking that the boy must not escape. 3 or 4 seconds can preserve a life. Edna twisted free just sufficiently to tear the shawl from Gideon's grip and throw herself sideways toward the ditch line. Not toward escape, toward obstruction. She fell against Mercer's horse's forelegs. The animal spooked hard, crashed sideways, and hurled Mercer half out of the saddle. Lantern glass shattered in the mud. Darkness deepened at once. Then came the gunshot. To this day, no surviving account concurs whether Mercer fired deliberately, whether Gideon fired accidentally in the scramble, or whether Whitcomb himself seized the pistol in panic. What is certain is this: one shot broke the dark, and Mama Edna collapsed at the road's edge before the creek turn. Shot through the chest, slightly left of center. She did not die instantly. Mercer regained control of his horse. Gideon dragged Whitcomb back from the mud. 2 searchers rushed forward from the plantation yard with another lantern. They discovered Edna on her side, one hand pressed beneath her, blood moving slowly into the wet earth. Where is he? Whitcomb rasped again, pale now, shaking from pain and rage. Edna looked beyond him, toward the west dark, toward wherever Josiah had gone. Then she uttered the only words left to say: "Gone." Whitcomb ordered the search expanded. They searched until dawn. They discovered broken branches, a small footprint near the creek bend, a torn thread on a low briar, and nothing more. Rain finally arrived before sunrise and weakened what trail remained. By noon on January 14, 1860, Mercer had declared the pursuit impractical. Gideon argued for hounds from farther south. Whitcomb, feverish from the stab wound and half-mad with humiliation, raged from his bed. But by then, the window had closed. Josiah, Whitcomb's ledger name, because of course they had inscribed him under the master's name rather than his own blood, was marked not sold, but missing. Missing. That word deserves scrutiny. Slave records frequently employed it to conceal the moral meaning of escape. Missing from whom? Missing from what? A boy fleeing sale was not missing in any honest sense. He was reclaiming his own body from theft. Mama Edna died shortly after sunrise on January 14, 1860, without providing them with anything further. No priest attended. No respectable obituary followed. No court recorded her as defender of kin, strategist of resistance, or witness against 6 generations of predation. The plantation interred her in the black ground, beyond the Pekin line, with no stone ordered by the house. If memory had depended on the people who owned her, she would have disappeared entirely. But memory did not belong to them. Hester remembered the medicine cabinet. Caleb remembered the road. Dinah remembered the questions posed in fragments. The children remembered the whispers. The elderly remembered 6 masters dead strangely, and one old woman still standing until the final winter. As for Josiah, oral accounts diverged after that, as they frequently do when official history has done its utmost to erase the vulnerable. One version placed him near a free black settlement north of the timberline within 3 days. Another claimed he reached river labor camps under a false name and later crossed farther west. A third, told decades after emancipation by Dinah Reed's granddaughter, insisted a lean black man in his 20s returned once in 1871 to stand at the edge of the burial ground at dusk, hat in hand, before departing again without speaking. No ledger confirms it, but ledgers confirmed many lies and omitted many truths. Moral history must sometimes lean on the testimony of the people denied ink. What is beyond dispute is simpler and stronger. A woman said to be 103 years old, enslaved since the 18th century, outlived 6 masters, and used the final portion of her life to prevent the sale of her last grandchild. That is not folklore. That is an indictment of the world that made such courage necessary. Remember her correctly, not as a ghost story for plantation tourists, not as a quaint tale of resilience, not as a decorative symbol of suffering made noble by distance. Remember her as evidence. Evidence that the enslaved observed everything. Evidence that old age under bondage could still become strategy. Evidence that family, even under constant theft, remained powerful enough to inspire lethal risk. Evidence that the people labeled powerless frequently understood power more accurately than those who wielded it. And remember this as well. Slaveholders wrote property law, wills, account books, and sale notices. But the final meaning of their world was frequently written elsewhere. On roads at night, in whispered names, in vanished children, in graves without markers, and in the choices made by those they thought too broken to act. If you're listening from Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, or anywhere the soil still holds stories like this, subscribe and comment with your location and share your theory. Did Josiah reach freedom, return in secret years later, or carry Mama Edna's silence into another life under another name?